Okay, so basically the question, I mean, why do we do the reuse this year, or why we do reuse anyway in APSS and in so many projects right now in this region and all over the world, of course, but somehow in this region, in former Yugoslavia region, and maybe in socialism countries, this has been kind of a very hot topic lately. I just want to kind of remind how it started, and some of these people are here even today. This was the first APSS, and it's actually the place where reuse started when we moved into the prison and when we have started Kotor Architecture Prison Summer School. So why we started KotorAPSS is not because we wanted to have a workshop and kind of do these things because, of course, we all like to be involved in architecture, but because we wanted to deal with these real problems present in Kotor, around Kotor, and in Montenegro, especially coastal area. So the prison is the building, a very interesting building. My first time when I was inside was sometime during high school. There was this guy who used to live in the prison, of course, illegally, and he would charge something like 10 euros to students to stay there overnight. He grew some illegal stuff in the backyard, and so this was his kind of small business. And this is first APSS. So Anna is here, Jelena is here, and Matija is here today as well. It was the first group of very brave students who kind of went into something that they haven't done before. Some of them in their first year of architectural school as well. In this first year, we kind of dealt with the prison in a way, okay, how we can turn it into something but leave it as it is. And what I used to think is that just moving into the prison was really a statement of reuse, although at that point we didn't want to do the reuse, or we had no clue it's going to develop into the reuse, but we just wanted to deal with the prison and kind of find a way of how we can turn this amazing structure into something that can be very useful, not only for us, but for many other students, many other professions, or people just visiting Kotor. Now, 4 years later, the prison is still there, and now it's not even used by us. The reason is because a lot of money needs to be invested, and we kind of fought for it, but it's a slow process with institutions and so on. After this year, we did a project where we kind of turned prison into multifunctional space that accommodates residents as well. And this space could be used by workshops and schools like ours, but also it could just be a hotel where people can stay if there is nothing going on there. So hopefully this project will develop further. Now it's being finished, and then hopefully next year they'll invest some money so we can go back there. Then Hotel Fjord happened. Boštjan has told you about this. I'm just going to go through some images quickly. Hotel Fjord is also one of these very present structures in Kotor. This amazing space, and this is not only, you know, kind of fetishizing ruins, something we talk about a lot lately, but it's really, when you go there, you see the potential of the space that's really amazing. And having it empty for now 11 years, I think it's really not only a shame, but it tells a lot about the whole society that lives around it. So these are some images, and we even made some postcards for you that were outside for that. And as Boštjan mentioned, we did the Grand Hotel Fjord project. We did a study and tried to explain why is it easier and important to keep the structure and deal with it and turn it into something better instead of just demolishing it, spending a lot of money to demolish it and then to build the structure of the same size that's new and different. And that's a hotel also, again. After that, we went into the surroundings of Hotel Fjord, and these are also very interesting spaces. You can walk through them even now. There is the Jugotania building that was empty at that time. Now it has been used by the investor that bought it to turn it into a hotel. They couldn't turn it into a hotel immediately, so they turned it into an art center that somehow works for 2 years now. The Riviera factory residential area that's also not very nice, and so on. So basically there is Old Town, the UNESCO heritage, very important thing in Montenegro is there are not so many UNESCO points in Montenegro. There is Old Town Kotor with the surrounding area, Kotor Boka Bay that is protected as well, and Durmitor on the north that's also UNESCO site. So as you already very well know, this is a very important place. There are some strict rules on how to build in and around places like this that has to be, of course, respected. But also these rules are often misused, misinterpreted, and not very well taken to the site itself. So basically the area, this is Hotel Fjord, this is Old Town Kotor, and this is the industrial area that we dealt with in 2014. And we actually tested of what might be the resort of today. We called it Open Resort Kotor. We have kind of, and maybe Nina and Kash are here, who were also students that year. All the groups of students, they worked in pairs, and they kind of analyzed all the resorts present in Montenegro today, all their good and bad things about them, the facts about all-inclusive resorts, about real estate-driven resorts, and so on. So we try to kind of think of all these problems and all these potentials and develop something that's called Open Resort, and it's open to citizens and to visitors, and that gives something to contemporary traveler according to, contemporary needs of a traveler today. Hotel Fjord is something, this 2013 and Grand Hotel Fjord was kind of the most successful KotorAPSS because we really not invented, but kind of this methodology came out of the whole concept where we worked all day with the students. We kind of would conclude the day and then have the next step for the next day. It's not one of those workshops where you have a goal that you go towards and then you just achieve it at the end in any way. It was very systematic work, very hard work, and then with some great results. But Open Resort Kotor was something that for me was very important because we took the same idea outside, we took it on the more urban level, and we kind of also included something that was more of a global topic, and a very hot global topic at that time. Today as well. So this was also reuse, also a very systematic all day, all night work with students with then some kind of final presentations at the end. And there was, of course, this kind of major thing we've done together with this team, and of course Andreas and Dilka Rubi and Nebojša Adžić, and this was the presentation at the Venice Biennale in 2014. Of course, many of you already know Treasures in Disguise, so it was Fjord. Basically, as Boštjan already mentioned, we made these models where we wanted to show the potential of the space. We did not want to deal with what these buildings could be or should be, or how we can redevelop them, recreate them, or reprogram them. But we just wanted to show how really these buildings amazing are. And Hotel Fjord is probably the one that has the least of kind of an architectural quality. It's not this great modernist Yugoslavian building, it's something different. So this is the model building on the site. This is the model that Boštjan showed already. Dom Revolucije as well. These are the sketches for the models, the building, and the model in the end. Memorial home, or actually Spomen dom in Kolašin, also done by Marko Mušić in the northern part of Montenegro. This is a building that's actually used in part of it, but this main space that we actually showed in Venice, it's not used. It's the main auditorium that used to be used, that used to be this main cultural hub for this small town. Something very specific for all Yugoslavian towns where you have a cultural center as a must in the town. And this is the model. Kayak Club Galeb is probably one of these buildings with the most architectural quality, and really an amazing building and an amazing site in Podgorica, right on the river, very contextual as well, and not used lately except for kayaks that are stored there instead of being this really kind of leisure spot of the city. But many other people do, and think about reuse as well. Maro Mrduljaš, who was also, who was supposed to be here today as well, but couldn't at the last moment. He was present in APSS several times, and he worked with us on several issues and topics. And most of you know his work, but he is the one that actually started this huge topic of Yugoslavian architecture that's now really going very far. With unfinished modernizations.
Napušteni, zaboravljeni, ruševni prostori koje polako zaposjeda priroda čine se poput ostataka neke davne nestale civilizacije. Odmarališta, hoteli, moteli. Ova arhitektura nije starija od 40-50 godina. Nastala je u vrijeme turističkog buma u kojem je na Jadranskoj obali sagrađeno više nego ikad prije ili ikada poslije na ovim prostorima. Brutalnost ogoljivih prostora i melankolija propadanja danas u njih privlači sve više urbanih istraživača, arhitekata i umjetnika, ali i znatiželjnih turista u potrazi za preostacima ne tako davne povijesti. Arhitekt Maro Mrduljaš, vodeći stručnjak za modernu arhitekturu regije, već godinama vodi grupe s uglednih svjetskih sveučilišta po ostacima ove internacionalno vrijedne baštine. Uz njegovu pomoć i naša ekipa krenula istražiti što se s ovim građevinama dogodilo, te kako je moderna arhitektura oblikovala život i sudbine ljudi koji su se njome koristili.
This is just a teaser for the whole series. What I wanted to show is that really this is a very, very important story, the story of reuse, especially now in former Yugoslavia, but also all around the world. Then what we've done, and of course you know this, the project Solana for Venice Biennale this year with Bart Lutzma and Katarina Weinberger and all the teams that are here today and tomorrow. We did not approach it as a reuse, but of course it somehow turned to be reuse as well. Dealing with the problems in a space that surrounds us, it somehow brings you back to reuse too. So we'll talk about this tomorrow, of course, all day. What we've done there, but also what is the future of it, what could be the future steps, or how we can all work together towards the better future of this site. Also, there are some other topics waiting to be discovered in the light of reuse. This is an amazing building in Herceg Novi, and Srđan probably knows it the best if he is here, yes. Nikola Dobrović, dječje odjeljenje bolnice u Herceg-Novom ili kako institutu u Herceg-Novom. I've been to this building several years ago. We kind of had to go through the window to go in as the building is part of this kind of economical administrative process, whatever, where it should be sold as part of a bigger company that owns more objects in Herceg-Novi as well. But maybe this is one of three the most interesting potential reuse sites in Montenegro today. So, I mean, while working on all these topics in the past year, we have developed this thought that we should kind of gather all these things that we worked on, all the things that we have discussed and wrote and so on, and develop a book. The book, we've been kind of talking about it and working on it for kind of a long time now, but now we're going into the last phase, and the discussion today is a kind of part of the whole process as well. The book is on reuse, except that we have added like 3 additional letters. And Ian, forgive me, this is not a design, it's just a word. So it's reuseism. And it's not a reuseism as a big statement, but it's just something that we think about constantly, that we work on, and that we really want to take to the next level. So I invite now all the reuse people to join me on the stage. We're going to have to reuse the stage. We're going to have a kind of talk, and since moderating is not as easy as it might seem, I kindly invite you to participate. So please comment, ask questions, and kind of help us through.
Okay, I want to start with questioning the last of the speakers, Bostian. And so you presented the proposal for Dom Revoluție, and I think what became very obvious is that you dealt with not only with piece of architecture that was intentionally designed by someone, but a place that has been shaped by many different forces. And you mentioned this architect who originally built it. So, but I mean, he intended this as a cultural center. And what you dealt with was not a cultural center, but a ruin of an unfinished cultural center. So I'm asking myself, what does this reuse, what does it mean for the role of the architect and as an author or creator, or for the notion of authorship in your profession?
So, Luis, are you referring to what is our relationship to the authorship of the existing building, or how do we feel when dealing with a building which has not been designed by us, by someone else? I mean, it's a very tricky question. I mean, it's also very tricky how you actually approach to that. And, you know, just as a curiosity, we have been trying to establish a contact with the architect, who actually, I mean, it's still alive and very much alive, and he actually refused to kind of get in touch with us, you know. But I mean, I'm kind of, if I talk like personally, I'm like pretty sort of comfortable and content with the way how we approach it, you know. I mean, I would always say, you know, this is the building which was designed by Marko Mušić. So he's the author of what you see and stands there. What is our approach is actually a reuse of the structure which is standing there and which was built according to the project of Marko Mušić. So it's this different. I mean, it's kind of like almost like a dichotomy, you know. So this is the project which was built according to the project by the project of Marko Mušić. But what we do is we enter into a kind of like a different state, We didn't enter into the project of Marko Vučić, but we entered into the state, which, was not changed or renovate of the theater, which was done by another architect, into something else. But we actually approach what could be a potential of the architecture quality or of the volume or of the space which is there in the condition which has not been completed, So it's, I would say it's not preservation, it's not conservation, it's not renovation, because it's, but it's kind of a reuse. Reuse of a structure which stands there, And yesterday, Milos and I we discussed, is this something which works against the function for which was it's primarily designed or defined? And I would say no. The function is still, the function of the space, it's something else than the program, We don't work against the function. It's not about providing a new function, but it's about providing or proposing or unveiling the program for which this building was never thought of,
Yeah, I also meant this question in a way of how the role of an architect is maybe and the work is maybe changed through more reuse in the architectural practice.
I think that this is what I mentioned during the presentation. It's a reuse. I would always connect it with unfinished condition or incompleteness. So in order to design or think about the reuse, you have to think about that what you are doing, it's not the final condition. It's on the final stage. And this, in my opinion, completely, I want to say like changes, but it really influences the way how one would actually consider as an architect its own, approach or like task. So you do design something which could be, it's more like, as I said before, it's more about providing a hardware, and then software will actually change the building. Okay, oof. Haris.
So in many presentations, speakers were referring to Yugoslavian modernist architecture, and with Cosmos, we have you here as architects who have recently, with the EMA, with the EMA project, converted former UdSSR factory into a contemporary space. So, how important was the history that is also condensed in the building, in comparison to the shopping mall that was only recently completed or never completed, as a building that is not so contaminated with history, that doesn't have so many connotations?
I think for that, answering your question, the first project, the last shown, but the first you're asking, Emma, it had a certain specificity because we knew that we are temporarily dealing with this structure. So I think if we were designing it for a permanent use, I think we would do a different project. And that's why we kind of had a carte blanche of being, I think, more radical and more, let's say, linear in our concept, because that's what we wanted to do. And for example, if we see at the project of Dom Revoluție, I think we saw from the presentation of a deep analysis of the project, which was, let's say, not like we kind of made with Emma like a brush stroke which went through the whole project, like one move, because we knew this will be used temporary. And I think this is how to answer this temporary use. And I think if you are doing something like a permanent reuse of the project, the analysis should be much more detailed. And I think this is about Emma. And about the other project, of course, when you don't have so much history and basically the architecture like is not designed. Basically, it's a nameless architectural office, like which designed this mall. Maybe it was even not designed by an architect, but like some pre-made solution. So basically, there we had much more freedom in also not being afraid to like ruin some historical architecture or like to offend like a living architect. So it was a much easier, but also much more fun way to communicate with such a building. Basically, we could do whatever we want, but we tried to maintain even this little history which it had, this shopping mall which was there for like 1 year.
I have to add on this. I think this question of permanent and temporary is really interesting because, I mean, what is permanent is the real question, as I don't think there is such a thing as permanent, especially now when we kind of face these questions. And I think also Dom Revolucije has this temporarity. I mean, this new project for Dom Revolucije has this temporarity in its concept. And I think in the way, in the approach, this was kind of something that was more relaxing in a way about the project because, I mean, you just kind of try to do your best and, you know, make a new input to the building or make some new program or something and don't think of how permanent or unpermanent this is. And I think this could create a very good project. It's also I think related to this question of the history of the site, and this is especially present in, I mean, in all of these, in what Haris was talking about as well, and in the pyramid in Tirana, in this object as well. I mean, especially here in these countries, this kind of public opinion is usually based like at least 80% of the on the history of the site. So people usually hate it because it belongs to the time that they do not want to relate to anymore. So they don't want to see it reused. They want to just not to see it, and they want some new shopping mall, apartment buildings, or whatever. So this is also kind of very important question on how you make or how do you talk to the public, or how do you kind of try to explain to the public that you can reuse the building and not deal with the history. Like, for example, for me, when I was first time in Dom Revolucije, I thought, okay, I mean, it's so ideology that you need another ideology to finish it. I mean, and this would probably, if we really think about the moment today, this would be kind of a capitalism, so it would become a shopping mall if we kind of continue on this path. But you really need to be kind of smart about it, not think about a history of the site, or just consider it in a way and make a new project that's not too much of a statement, really, just an approach.
If I may add just a very small thing, even in looking at the presentation, I think that what makes the project so strong and what I really, really enjoyed is the element of safety. So what other way to intervene into such an ideological building than to say, first thing we want to do, we want to make it safe so people don't fall down. And so that already, I think, attacks that sort of approach that people have to a building. You're not actually changing it, or you're not trying to either justify it or rationalize it. You're just trying to make it safe for people to use.
May I just answer your question, Luis? No, I kind of have thought a little bit. It's you know, what actually, it's a question of design. When you refer before to the, you know, authorship, you know. So what we try to do, or what we're trying to do in the Dom Revolucije, is actually not impose another kind of style or another really, sort of formal design, which would kind of say, okay, yeah, this is, you see, you know, this is what we have done in comparison or in relation to what has been on site before, you know. So it's basically a design, previous design versus contemporary strategy, you know. And, you know, maybe this function in that building, you know. I don't know, if you take Hotel Fjord, for example, how do you, maybe when you intervene or if you reuse these spaces, maybe a kind of new type of design would be needed, So what I'm saying, it's very difficult to generalize. I think there are, and this also, I would say, it's part of the kind of very contemporary, of the zeitgeist, So that, you go, there are no specific rules, You really have to kind of analyze and be very specific from case to case. I would say, if you deal with, I don't know, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sarajevo, Yeah, so as you're doing, so if you intervene there, since you have like a very sort of modernist late 50s, early 60s block building, I mean, one would say, I would always question what is the level of design, like design in terms of, expression of your own architect's gesture, Is it more like a strategy, or it's more like a scenarios, or it's more like, you say, okay, I'm not interested in design, I'm not interested in formal expressions, I'm interested in strategies, as Urban Think Tank is doing, And I really wonder, what is your relationship towards that, Thank you.
Thank you, Bastian. Good question, and I think I find it very difficult when we talk about manifestos. What should the architect do? It sounds very generalistic. I would say, and I agree with you, it depends by case of a case approach. What we had there, we tried to anticipate what is there. What is there is a situation where in 1996 you had a museum structure, but you didn't have a content and you didn't have a name. So you didn't have even a software, but you didn't even have the name of the software. And it was somehow then filled with war artifacts and different things, and then it emerged into what it is today. It's a sort of a cultural center. And when you talk to the museum director, who's of course, I don't want to say frustrated, but who is really, really doesn't believe in governmental structures because she feels left alone. For 4 years, she works voluntarily in a national museum in a country. And when we started kind of analyzing, talking to her, the intervention came by itself. We said, you know what, we would like to work with our students. We organized a workshop. She told me, I don't have a workshop space. And we said, okay, let's design it. And we did it. We executed it in 2 months. So I'm really I don't believe in strategies per se because I think it's speculative. Strategies have often different phases, and if one of the phases doesn't turn out as you want, then all the other phases are going to butterfly effect. So I don't really believe in sort of predicting the future to some. Your scenarios is good. It's good to have a vision, but I would say, well, for us working in this environment, it took us, and then coming to the role of the architect. I was a psychologist. I was an activist. I was painting the wall. Us, the whole team. We tried to talk to governmental structures. We brought students, organized these events there, facade shows, sort of in a very blurry zone between legal and illegal. So, and this is my message maybe for the audience. It's in the Balkans, my generation, we waited for the competitions, we waited for the contracts, we waited and waited and waited and didn't arrive. So what we did is many of us, it just went abroad and came back and teamed up with different people in very sort of informal alliances, and the result of all these processes was to deal with this museum. And I would say what we did I would say also as an intellectual provocation, but also as a real idea for temporary intervention, is to protect it, because it's literally leaking. I can show you my WhatsApp. When the museum director sent me 2 days ago, she's kind of, many people think those buckets on the floor is an art installation. It's not. It's just catching the water from the roof. So, those are harsh realities, and many people don't understand. We go to the ETH of Zurich, the famous polytechnic in Switzerland, and then you have to explain to your dean that you deal with that you did an illegal intervention in Sarajevo. So it's really, we learned a lot in the process, and again, for the young students, you don't wait for, sit down, wait for competitions to do renderings and models. You gotta go out there and engage with a very difficult context, and it's very difficult. So, and I see that you guys here do it in an amazing way in Montenegro. So I'm very, again, happy to be here and see what you guys do.
I just want to refer again to your project, which was a kind of also marketing for the space. For future development, and you did this social media strategy you were mentioning. So with Ian from Sheffield and from TDR, we have someone who's a graphic designer who's also into branding campaigns, and so I wanted to ask you, what do you think of their project, and also what does reuse mean in your profession?
Okay, so I was concentrating more on the second part of your question. Once I realised you were asking me. So, I mean, reusism for me, I think reusism is really interesting in that it's more interesting for me as an observation rather than it's not like it's not an ism. I think that has a set of rules that should be applied. And the thing that makes it more interesting for me isn't not being an architect, but being someone who's. I mean, my job is really people. It's the clients I work with, and it's the audience that they want to communicate with. So on a branding project, you have certain stakeholders, people inside the organisation, people outside. If it's a global campaign for someone like Coca-Cola, then you've got to second guess. You've got to try and identify potential markets, secondary markets, ambient targets, and ambient targeting. And then you have to work out how to say what your client wants to say in such a way that the identified audiences will respond in a way that you want them to, etc. So it's about understanding people, really, and problem solving. That's the first thing about designing for me. And in the context of that, then reusism is really... there's a main question that I ask all the time, and it's why do we do what we do on any level? And so the question, or the questions that really kind of interest me in reusism is why were these... Okay, right, let's go right back to the beginning. Why were the buildings that are ruins built in the first place? And what does that say about us as a society? And then why weren't they finished? And what does that say about us as a society? And then what do we do with them? So I'm not so... it might be quite a prickly topic where say, well, you're remixing someone else's building and who has authorship. And I think that for me, that's something that you architects have to deal with internally, because I think that the bigger picture is that it doesn't, for me, it doesn't really matter who built it in the first place, and it doesn't really matter who's doing what now. It's what does it mean? And I find it really fascinating in terms of. I mean, you didn't show it this year, but the shopping mall by the sports centre in Ljubljana, which has some kind of attraction to me because we went there and it was still, so it wasn't even a building site. It was just like you were pointing at stones and bushes and saying that's going to be a shop and that bush is going to be a sports centre.
And this will be a ruin.
Yeah, this is going to be a ruin. But I like the idea of and I think when I was teaching in Lausanne at ECAL, there was a girl who did a whole photographic project about the vast area of Zurich airport, which was built and then never used after 9/11, and the way that then Frankfurt became the hub, and Zurich didn't need the additional stuff. So you've got purpose-built structures that you can almost imagine the people flowing through and the traffic flowing through it, except it's not that they aren't there anymore. They never were. And so I kind of get fascinated by the idea of ghosts of people who were never there. Mm-hmm. And I think there's also an element of in reuses of nostalgia, and nostalgia for things that we've actually never experienced ourselves, but we quite like the idea of. And there's a lot of, at the moment, there's a lot of brutalist architecture activity on Facebook with, Brutalist Architecture Appreciation Society, the Royal Architecture or whatever. There's any number of them, which itself sounds like a Monty Python sketch. But anyway, but it's funny because I grew up in a new town, a satellite town outside London, in the 70s. And then people keep posting these images of new towns and sort of concrete structures. And they look brilliant to me because they're very graphic and they're very sort of angular. But there's that point that they always look good in black and white, but they don't look so good in colour. So there's that sort of sense of what is it? So that's that. I guess that's the ruin porn. I've got a collection if anybody wants to share. And now I'm just talking because I'm trying to remember what the first question was. Oh, I know, yeah, about yeah. So, yeah, it's more pointless. Okay, so yeah, I mean, you were talking about the book, Cosmos book.
The campaign around the email project that became a social media icon.
Oh yeah.
So many people, and we kind of, from the very beginning, you were very important on Facebook, and it was really important part of the design.
I think, I mean, all this kind of comes back to the communication, and that all of us involved in any kind of creative activity need to utilise all. It's communication by any means necessary, isn't it? But what I was really interested in was the book where you'd got every kind of email, and it's I mean, I don't know if you've seen other examples of it, but it's interesting how much that kind of thing has cropped up recently. That it's I guess it's part of the zeitgeist, but I think it's this idea of deconstructing the process of years and years and years of ever sort of deeper and possibly more pointless analysis of what we do and why. But there's a sense that we all want to kind of understand what we're doing and show that we understand what we're doing without really showing that we're trying to understand what we're doing. And that kind of deconstructive kind of peeling back of the layers of just saying, okay, well, we're not going to edit this, we're just going to do it. And then it's, I mean, you see quite a lot of it, which is where it's actually just screen grabs of the conversations, online or email or other social media. And I think that, and that's another interesting thing, that it used to be that people would want to edit it and control it. And now I wonder whether there's that sort of, as creatives, I'm not talking about as sort of, mind control or anything subversive like that, but I wonder kind of why that's a zeitgeist thing now. And I think that the reusism thing, which is obviously has an element of not so much in architecture, but as a cultural and social phenomenon, has some grounding in the idea of recycling and being sustainable and not throwing away the past and keeping things and making use of stuff and not being wasteful. But I think there's also that sort of sense that there's, I don't know whether extruding from your sort of deconstructed kind of interview or information dissemination, I just wonder, what that all kind of means, whether we're all getting so analytical that we're kind of afraid to actually just kind of stand up and say, we did this because, and we're ticking the sustainability boxes and everything. And I'm running out of words now, so you can.
What about the reuser? We talk about reuse, but not so much about the reuser. So who's the client? Who's the user?
Or you forgot about it?
No. I'm okay. I can invent a new one in any moment. No, I had a few things, but whenever you want. Like
I have a question for Luis.
Just bring me in when you feel like it. Yeah? I still have it here.
No, it's just it's now even since do you think that when you use the word reuse or reusism, or when we talk about reuse of buildings, the image I've got in my mind, it's it has to do with kind of informal, a bit shabby, a bit undesigned, kind of graffiti-like. It's something which is. It's not about renovation. It's not about bringing like a new life or renovate, But it's a kind of like a reuse. So if you take like a church which has been converted into a living apartment, or a factory which has become a loft, So is that about reuse or is it about renovation? I mean, what is that about, I mean, all the examples, also what we discussed today, it was all about something which is there, existing, and then we kind of more or less shy in a kind of, no shy, it's not a proper, subtle way, intervene without having an intention to change or to completely convert even the image of that existing structure.
I think that the key thing there is the use. If you use a consumer product, you don't redesign it, you don't renovate it, you're using it. And I think that for me the interesting thing about the reusism is the use that people put it to. And I mean, as a romantic notion, I like the idea of people taking over unused spaces and using them for what they need to use them for. And you last year you made the example of the people using the shopping mall for Tai Chi because it was a really it was a great place because of the space and that I think is the reusism. And so all the examples of how these structures are being used or reused, that's the key thing, isn't it? It's the use. It's not the renovation. It's not the redesign.
But just briefly, I mean, again, who's the reuser? You don't have a user yet because it's an empty building. In the Torre David and Museum of Revolution, there is already someone. So I'm asking myself, who do we design this for? I would know that I saw already offered by bed shops Kladionica to move in the Museum of Revolution. So, also when you show this auditorium, and I'm asking myself, who will going to use it? I already saw Sandra Africa dancing in one of those places. So, who do we design for? Society, there are certain, I would say, deviations, and I would say we have to be very careful in defining top-down this use and say this is going to be intellectual workshop suddenly appearing. So it's again about the analysis, who's going to use it.
I think why are we so being shy in a way about it is because, I mean, we don't know. I mean, there is a process ahead. I think what's wrong with many of these buildings is that there was an approach that had this attention, like, I really know exactly what to do with it. And then it fell apart. So I think the good process is being kind of settled about it and going into it. But Luisa, you need the mic. Marco has a question first, so we go there and then we continue.
Right, thank you. Now, it was just more like a comment, in fact, that I want to make now. And I think it's more related to the topic of health and safety somehow, which I found very interesting. And particularly in relationship to the project, like what is the name? The blue glass. Yeah, exactly. Because, like, I've been 15 years in the UK now, and UK is the country of health and safety. It's kind of absolutely fixated about health and safety. But there is one typology in which somehow all health and safety is suspended, and that is like playgrounds. And sometimes you see like little kids like 10 meters above suspended to a rope, and it's like, you know, as an Italian, you're like, oh my God. You know? But in reality, the reason why that is possible or allowed is because playgrounds are, let's say, scientifically studied to create the condition for kids, let's say, but even bigger kids, to test their limit, no? to sort of creatively engage with space and sort of appropriate it in their own way, according to their own abilities, and then also challenge their own abilities, etc., etc. No? So for me, that was always fascinating, because in a way it makes me think that there is a way of codifying, you know, spaces for a use that is not so determined, but it's really about learning, creatively testing yourself, and etc. And I found it quite interesting to discuss this here, because you know, I was telling you yesterday I climbed up the fortress here, which is, you know, a kind of ruin also. But and I found this quality, no, like that you are. It is not really very safe up there, but somehow you are allowed to go, and you're allowed to you know, find your way and test different climbing routes, and, you know, shall I go there, shall I not go there? And I found that really fun, like really kind of exciting and interesting in a way, no? So let's say, going back to the project, I was thinking like your decision to, for instance, allow for whole area to be, let's say, not programmed as such. But I think it could be like, maybe the next step could be really to think about a way of like recoding these areas. Let's call it them as a kind of playground if you want, but this is just a wording. But let's say through a set of rules that are perhaps also quite scientifically studied to allow for this kind of level of expression or exploration of, you know, creative engagement with this sort of urban space, which you know, makes it so exciting and actually potentially very, very, very active and engaging. And so in that sense, maybe it's about writing a new Neufert for these kind of spaces, no? If you want, like a kind of new code that regulates this relationship, but still allows, no, or even, you know, scientifically try to trigger this kind of. Then it's a really a new style, if you want. I don't know, but maybe style is a bad word, is an obsolete word. But actually, it is quite strong. It's not just I try to make the best out of it. It's really like quite radically new thing, no? And so maybe, yeah, that's it. That's my comment.
Thank you, Marco. Hello, did you have
to me, something that really struck me as focusing on users and users today was your example of this kind of modern vernacular of Albania, the many houses that are coming into being through the demands and through the needs of their inhabitants, and that, from my understanding, have become an important part of the character of building culture in your country, and also as a part of the character of the city. So how and you've shown examples of how you've now investigated how some of the buildings have been appropriated by the users and so on. So how are you applying this knowledge to future planning?
I think the example, more than reuse, is actually abuse, because that's what actually happened. And that's why it's so interesting in a way and attractive in terms of the intellectual sense. So I think that the problem with those examples, and with most of Tirana, is that when you come to a symposium and you talk about it, it's extremely interesting. And people are like, wow, so they built informal housing next to the building? But actually they built it on a road, on a playground, on a public park. So the often in those sort of interesting examples, the drama takes over the reality. So I think, though, that nevertheless there is a lot to learn in terms of how can you try and make a building more appropriate to its users. As also Harris was mentioning, so who does the use or the abuse or the reuse? How can you make a building appropriate to the ones who might come? I think that's also very much related to this temporaneity that we were talking about. So we're saying that, you know, the permanence of buildings. What is the permanence? We have a saying in Tirana, which I don't think that it's ours. We maybe borrowed it from somewhere. 90% of what we plan never gets built. And then 90% of what gets built is actually out of the plan. So it never was in any part of the plan. So that's something that really shows you that the approach that we have been having as a society, not as a profession, but towards these sort of enterprises, architecture, planning, is very static, it's very rational, and it's very cold. And I think that the power of some of the projects which were shown here today is such that it tries to bridge that gap between the architect as a cold intellectual philosopher, and it goes actually more towards going there and meddling with Sarajevo or with Dom Revolucije, so going there in the terrain and meeting the people who get to live those spaces. And I actually have a very interesting set of interviews from the people who inhabit my building. So how each of them, after they got this new space, what were they doing with it? Someone made it into a kitchen. One whole floor became an office, an architectural office, as I was explaining. So some people in the first floors, they just partitioned it into 3 parts and sold 2 parts off, so now there's 3 owners. Some people in the 4th floor, just 2 months ago, they opened a new door into the corridor, so now there's 2 apartments into the building. Of course, this was done illegally, true to the Balkanic experience. So I think that there's a lot to learn from these experiences, especially from South America and from other examples. But on the other hand, it's very important to keep perspective that as interesting as they are, they don't deal with the reality in the discussion that we have here. And we also have to bridge that gap between interestingness, reusism, and pragmatism.
I also think if we talk about the question of reuse, that there is always a question of heritage and monuments. And I mean, Lou can also respond to this, but I think Milos, in our conversations regarding the book, we always had this topic somewhere. I mean, there is certain heritage that needs to be reused, but there is also there are also some buildings that could be heritage or could be reused, or could it be both? It's always a question. I mean, this is also a question of conserving or just reusing.
I mean, I think that you can separate an object as a monument to its content, and it's done, and it's not in conflict. I mean, it can be in conflict, but it can be done in a way that it's not. So I think that it's completely feasible to use a good piece of architecture, something that's recognized as as a masterpiece, on a completely conflicted program to that was originally planned. And I think this is one of the leaps of how I understand reusism. The other leap is, if I refer maybe to your unanswered question about reuser, I think that one of the other leaps is specifically that you're not designing this to a specific reuser. You don't. I mean, if you do, or if you maybe create a new Neufert for the new situation, you just make a new, you make a new version of the old kind of planning, of the old architecture planning. It's specifically not describing the new patterns, but making one half of the way and leaving your hands off of the other half, and just in a way seeing or enabling what will happen. And just the third leap, maybe quickly to refer a little bit back, you showed maybe the most catastrophic client-architect relation in the 20th century, briefly, and and it's it's interesting because the architect pair and the client Hitler designed everything specifically for 1,000 years. So it was the program with maybe the longest leap in the future. It was meant and it resulted in 12 years and in ruins. So I think that a lot more permanent strategy would be not to plan on 1,000 years, maybe not even on 10 years. But I'm sure it could last for a lot longer than that.
So, just one sentence. So, guidelines won't work. So, Neufert and a hipster version of Neufert, you have to engage with the reality.
Well, my question, sometimes it's already addressed here and there, but of course, in my opinion, there's not such a thing as a permanent structure. Today we have been mainly talking about existing structures already there and how to reuse them. But what about new structures actually? I mean, don't we need to address reuse already in the new structures? Maybe it sounds a little bit like strange, and I was also thinking about, you know, this, for instance, the Dom building, you know, what happens in 10 years if it's abandoned again? You know, do we need to think about that already, or?
No. Actually, this is what I was referring to. It's the kind of, you know, that you as an architect actually get very close to a landscape architect. So basically what you do, it's a continuous unfinished condition. So to answer your question, you know, when you design a new building, could you design it that it's not completed, you know, unfinished, you know, that you leave, as Milos put it, you know, you take your hands off, you know, at a certain stage and say, okay, this is something, you know, which could just happen. You know.
Well, the question of gardening connects to what I wanted to ask, and I actually like the fact that you introduced the idea of landscape of gardening, because Milos, this is your name, he was mentioning about leaving open, but what does it mean to leave open if you don't have a language? If you leave completely open, you end up with misuse, right? If you don't know how to use something, if you don't develop a language for reusing something, you cannot reuse it. You know, I grew up in a place where everything was recycled because they understood how to do it, because they could read the pattern. They had a language to do it. But can the citizen that live around the buildings we are talking about, do they have a language to reuse it? Do they understand the pattern? Do they have a know-how? So if we leave it completely open, it's a little bit of a problem. If we gave a constraint of the Neufer, of course, we are in the old. But how do we trigger self-organization? That's the question, no? The garden is a good example because the landscape architect, I guess, the gardener, in Clement term, it's dealing with dynamics. So it forecasts dynamics that could emerge, exactly, you know. So you need to allow a certain degree of freedom, but it's not unknown, right? It is like a forecast. You can make a simulation and then the simulation will change because something will happen, but then, you know, you have a way of forecasting. So it's a sort of dynamic Neufer. It's not, you know, you know, it's a Neufer for self-organization, maybe. You know, it's a question of how do you deal with dynamic rule that, you know, need to be implemented, and people need to develop a language and know how to appropriate this type of, you know, urban forest, if we want to call it like this.
I think that it's useful to observe how, for instance, the ruins act on people, or how people experience ruins, or buildings in their stages. So when a building for a specific role is completed and done just as it is, it's perfect for that one function, but basically for none other. On the other extreme, when a building is completely derelict and there's not even ruins, but just the rubble, so you basically had a flat land that's seemingly like countless possibilities, but you can't react to anything, like you said. And that is the complete openness. And complete openness is also completely inert. But the ruin becomes the most interesting somewhere in between in this strange moment where it's partly cracking, partly opening, partly countering its architect's intentions, while still having clear structure. Dome of Revolution is interesting because even though it was never finished, it has small rooms, it has middle rooms, it has huge halls, it has very clear structure for a purpose that no one almost cannot reconstruct now, but it enables very, very different reactions to all sorts of rooms. And I suppose, I mean, it's a difficult question. It's hard to codify a language, but I suppose that very quickly to say that if you build a building that has an array of different spaces, you enable the most number of possibilities so that you can react to it in the most number of different scenarios, if you know what I mean. You make a structure that is structured variously. So you don't have just a free plan, which you cannot react to, or you don't have just tabula rasa. You have different kind of arrays, and that enables you to react differently in different scenarios. I would say that that's maybe the best version that I can think of right now.
Just have to write it.
This will be written in the book.
Maybe I want to finish with a quote from Stuart Brand, because I recently rewatched his BBC TV series, How Buildings Learn, and that fits to your comment in the front row. Because he said, a building is not something you finish, a building is something you start. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here, for participating, and for contributing to such an important topic as reuse. And hvala vama svima što ste bili ovdje. Thank you, the Project Solana crew.